Alright, you guys. So you guys are pieces, what you're saying. No. Guys, listen up. Fire road is out of bounds, gentlemen.
Go, guys. Run. Y'all gotta run together.
Go, 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 go. Let's move it. Go. Ah!
Hello everyone, this is Afaff Paintball from Afaff Paintball Field Reviews, and today I want to talk about Warzone Paintball in Rhode Island. Now, we went there a couple months ago in the fall, and then a few months before that in the summer for the events Domination 1 and Domination 2, which is just a quick disclaimer saying that we didn't go for normal walk-on, which is what we usually do for these, so we can kind of get a feel for it. We went in an event, which sets it up quite differently for us, but I think we still got the general information and knowledge from playing that we would need to make this video and review it properly. So, without further ado, I just want to hook that in there, quick disclaimer, but without further ado, let's get right into his review. So, I've noticed with the fields, especially here in the northeast, New England, found that it's hugely defined by hills. That's kind of a given, but it's still something to definitely consider when reviewing a field, such as I'm doing, and I've noticed, and it's how each different field handles these hills as kind of a concept for their fields. So, let's say for Warzone, for instance, they use them as objective base. I actually really liked how they use them. This is definitely a pro for them. They definitely use them as like objective bases. So they're rather complex objectives, semi-complex objectives, I'll say, because they aren't. They're often like flags or spin wheels, which are just kind of like red or blue wheels that you can spin to your team's side. They use those around the field, but they also put them on top of hills or just below hills, so that one team, if team can get to a hill, they can definitely use it as an advantage. They often put fortresses or obstacles or like small buildings on the hills so that it gives the players a better advantage, a strategic advantage, if they use it properly. And I think that's really cool because it rewards the player accordingly. Luckily, these hills did not carry over to their speedball, which was made on flat ground, and they both of their speedball fields, there were two of them, appeared to be well maintained and more than presentable to play on. Teams and experienced players had a tendency to stay on this field, which resulted in a higher skill level overall in order to keep these up with these players. So often it wouldn't be like the rentals or the new guys, it would be the actual setup teams or highly experienced speedball players, usually with designated speedball guns, that were actually playing on these fields. Going back to the woodsball fields, considering we didn't really play much on the speedball, so I can't really give any huge, like, oh, here's the best way to go, this is how you can play it. But for the woodsball fields, I found that they were under a canopy of trees. So the branches and leaves definitely covered over the entire field. And I want to stop here, hit the brakes for a moment, and talk about the concept, another concept. So we had the hills before, and this is a different one that I've been noticing more as I've been doing these reviews, is trees and how the fields handle them. So for this one, I want to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. In Warzone's case, they did use the trees. They left them as is. They didn't try and clear out as much as they could. Rather, they just left them there and just built around them, basically. And that provides one very distinct, very useful advantage that I've noticed that was most prevalent for them, is that it provides good shade, and it can make the gameplay more enjoyable for most, and it gives a more comforting appeal to the field, because you're not in the sun with the sun on your backs. You're not getting like sunburned. Lord knows I'll get that from like an open field where there's no cover at all. Rather, you're getting a nice shade to go over the whole field, and it makes it more enjoyable for the players. The disadvantage, however, is that players can find their shots being blocked by branches that could be difficult to see. Branches and leaves, I should say, actually, that could block these shots going through, and it can be a little bit frustrating at times. That's true, but it's definitely something for the field to outweigh. Is it worth it to remove all these trees, or should we just leave them and use them kind of for their advantage? I don't think it's something that you should be like do or die on per se, because it's such a minute detail, but it's definitely something that is an interesting dynamic for the field to try and come with a solution, and I definitely like how Warzone handled it. They used it to make their whole field feel much more comfortable. You could play for a lot longer in their fields because they were in shade, as opposed to getting worn out in the open heat of the sun. So as for cover, the obstacles were carefully placed for the individual field, but I found that when the fields were combined for this specific event, and I'm sure they might combine them in walk-on play or regular play, there were some spaces in between that would form kind of a accidental bottleneck almost, because there was no cover for a short span of time, or for a short distance rather. And it's kind of an issue. And it's another one of the small issues that they even mentioned it briefly that it might be remedied by them, but it's something that added another dynamic that maybe even they weren't expecting. But it worked out in the end. I think it was still alright, even though it definitely slowed the movement of the actual play itself. And then for the rest of it, all the cover was actually very well made. For instance, there was a slit trench in one of the maps called Korea, and it had 2 bunkers on either side with a 2-story in front of it. And I thought that was very well placed because it kind of gave one team kind of a defensive advantage, while the other one had a cover advantage where if they made it up there, they could dive around and move. And they also had the hill on their back, so going back to those hills. But it definitely gave a different perspective for each side, and it was good to switch sides. It was like it gave some kind of dynamic without creating unbalanced gameplay. As for the underbrush and the shrubbery that would grow in any forest, they did remove that, a lot of it, so that it would create a better flowing gameplay, and it created faster movement throughout the field. So when you were respawning, for instance, you didn't have to avoid so much of this. They created trails so that you could kind of go through without having to worry about running into a giant bunch of undergrowth or thicket. Even though the gameplay was very spaced out due to the amount of players, though there were a decent amount of players, it was still a big enough field where you could easily find large sections without any action, or large sections that were used as flanking routes or like a low amount of action. The refs kept a very good job of kind of keeping a standoffish point from the actual players and only being there when they were needed. They didn't like run in or try to really get in on the players, kind of disconnecting the actual action because they had to avoid shooting the refs. But they didn't do any of that. But what they did do was keep a good eye on the actual players, and they gave them a fair amount of breathing room because most of the players were not first-timers and played fairly, and it helps that a lot of these people that were playing were locals and they knew them. So I found that it was actually, I think, more fun that they were kind of standing off more because you didn't have to think about them. They were always there when they needed to be, but they weren't there when they could get, shot or block a shot or something like that. So moving on, pro shops, so the actual shops that could be there wasn't really any to speak of, and only the necessities were being sold: air, paint, some small parts for air tanks, like some minor parts, but nothing significant, no actual pro shop to speak of. And then the fluidity between the rounds. The rounds were lengthened drastically due to the event style of Domination 1 and 2, which necessitated longer breaks. However, the referees were far more on their game than most of the players were when it came to getting back into the game. So I can't blame the field for some extended waiting periods between games every here and there. Usually we got back in within probably 20 minutes or so. The special rule there are 2 actually. 10-foot bunkering is illegal, so basically if you get 10 feet or closer to a player, usually this means that both players are out or the refs will back you off. That's one of those things that they would have to keep an eye for when they were watching the games. 10-foot bunkering. I didn't really see a lot of cases of this, and plus these were mostly experienced players who were used to these fields, so they kind of knew how to work around that rule, knew how to get the good angles and all this and that. So it wasn't a huge deal when we were there. But you could definitely see they were waiting for that kind of stuff to happen. There is no extra cost to play in the event. This is the other special rule I found really quite awesome, actually. The event was the same cost as the normal play, which is rather rare, actually. I don't see that a whole lot. Usually you have to pay a little bit extra. But it made it really convenient that there was no extra cost for players on a budget such as yours truly. And extra cost is regular, so I thought it was definitely a big merit for them for kind of taking that extra step for their own customers. In conclusion, I found that Warzone is a really awesome woodsball-based paintball field, but maintains a small but reliable speedball presence. Hills and tree canopy mark a natural signature over the fields that were being played on, and using these hills for defense is certainly an advantage for the strategically inclined, but weren't necessary. The barricades and sandbags also utilize the environment and were placed smartly throughout the play area. Refs, although laid back, knew where to be at the right times to catch all of the action and get players off the field if need be. In summary, I would recommend Warzone to any woodsball-centric players in the New England area, and even though they don't have a large player base right now, I think that they could definitely have the potential to become something unique and original as they're already kind of melding into. So I would definitely encourage joining them for their events, as they are a total blast. Thank you guys for listening to me talk about Warzone. I hope you guys check them out. I'll link their website down in the description below. I hope you enjoyed listening to kind of a little different perspective of this, especially with going into the hills and the tree canopies and things like that. And definitely comment below if you think I should do more stuff like that, or if you have any suggestions or comments on the fields, or even on my own video. I would love criticism. I really enjoy improving my videos. Alright, well, that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening, and this is Afaff signing off.